Hannah Palmer had been working at Stonehaven Estate for 3 years when the master returned from his long travels across the sea. She had never seen his face before that day, only knowing him through the fragments of conversation left behind by the kitchen maids and the older footmen during their brief rests in the lower halls. The rumors painted a picture of a man who was entirely detached from the world, a leader of a quiet, hidden people who possessed a strange and lasting existence. They said he was cold, that his demands were precise, and that he had left the city of Boston after a private matter that no one cared to name openly, but everyone seemed to remember. Hannah paid little attention to these stories, having learned through 22 years of navigating the world alone that what people said about their employers rarely matched the reality of the people themselves. She had been left as an infant at the door of St. Jude's orphanage, wrapped in a plain cotton cloth, with nothing but a single scrap of paper bearing her first name in a handwriting no one could identify. She grew up in a place that provided adequate shelter and simple food, but offered no true warmth, leaving her to discover early that the best way to keep a position was to be so thoroughly reliable that her presence was never questioned. At the grand estate, she looked after the household accounts and helped the head housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, keep the massive domestic operation running without a single mistake. She lived in a small room beneath the roof, owned 3 plain working dresses, and spent her days moving quietly through the stone corridors, like a shadow that belonged to the house itself. Waking up at 5:30 in the morning was a habit she had practiced for 3 years, because she found that the absolute silence of a house before dawn was the only space where she could truly belong to herself. During these early hours, she sat by her small window and wrote her observations in a plain paper notebook, using the clear, steady handwriting she had taught herself during the quiet nights at the orphanage. She had strong thoughts about the books she read and the world around her, though she never found an occasion to speak them aloud to the people she worked with. Over her time at the estate, she had quietly read through a large portion of the main library collection, during the late evenings when the rooms were empty and the daily tasks were fully completed. No one had ever told her she could not use the books, mostly because no one ever noticed her presence in the high-ceilinged rooms after dark. It was a specific kind of invisibility that came with being a quiet, competent worker, and she felt a private sense of pride in the fact that she had built a stable life with nothing but her own 2 hands. She did not resent the hard work or the lack of a family name. She simply accepted her circumstances and focused on the immediate duties before her, finding a calm rhythm in the steady turn of the seasons. The master returned to the estate on a cold Thursday afternoon in March, arriving with a small party of personal clerks and a collection of heavy trunks that required 6 staff members to move into the main halls. Hannah spent the middle of the day organizing the delivery of his personal effects, bringing her usual quiet efficiency to the chaotic scene until she encountered the man himself in the wide corridor outside the eastern suite. He was much taller than she had imagined, with hair as white as fresh winter snow, and skin so remarkably pale it looked like polished stone under the dim hallway lanterns. His eyes were a deep, dark gray that moved across the space with the automatic calculation of someone accustomed to monitoring their entire environment. He registered her presence as a member of his domestic staff and began to walk past without a word, his dark coat swirling slightly against the stone floor. Hannah did not step back or look away, as the other servants did. Instead, she stepped forward, because she noticed his personal clerk had dropped a wooden case of legal documents further down the hall. "Sir," Hannah said, keeping her voice calm and level so it carried clearly through the long corridor without sounding hurried. "Your clerk left this document case near the north entrance. I brought it up immediately because I believed you would require these specific papers for your work this evening." The white-haired man stopped his forward movement and turned his face fully toward her, his dark gray eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her with genuine attention. The silence between them lasted for several seconds while he scanned her face, his expression completely guarded but entirely free of the simple arrogance she had expected. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a distinct cadence that sounded older than the house itself. He reached out and took the wooden case from her hands, his long fingers brushing against her skin for a fleeting moment. His hand was remarkably cold, matching the temperature of the winter air outside, but his grip was firm and steady. "What is your name?" he asked, his gaze remaining fixed on her eyes with a quiet curiosity that did not waver. "Hannah Palmer, sir," she replied, making a small, neat courtesy that was polite but completely lacking in the nervous fear the other maids usually displayed. "I assist Mrs. Higgins with the accounts and the upper linen stores." He gave a single, slow nod to acknowledge her words, turning back toward his private study with the wooden box under his arm. "Return to your duties, Hannah," he murmured quietly as he walked away, his white hair catching the faint light of the candles. She watched him disappear behind the heavy oak door before she turned back toward the stairs, her mind entirely calm as she returned to her afternoon work. The rest of the household spent the evening discussing the master's peculiar habits, whispering about how he refused the dinner prepared by the cook, and chose to remain in his dark room with nothing but a cup of bitter tea. Hannah listened to the gossip while she helped clear the kitchen tables, but she kept her thoughts to herself, knowing that people often feared what they did not understand. She returned to her small room at the top of the house when the clock struck 10, closing her door against the cold draft that blew from the woods. She looked at her plain notebook on the table and realized she felt no fear toward the pale, white-haired king who now occupied the grand rooms below. She lay down to sleep with the quiet certainty that her life would continue its predictable pattern, regardless of the strange presence that had returned to Stonehaven Estate. Caleb Hawthorne had lived through enough decades to understand that human society was built on a series of elaborate performances, most of which he had chosen to avoid. He carried the heavy responsibilities of his position as the leader of his quiet, long-lived people, a duty that had fallen to him when his predecessor passed away many years before. The striking white hair and exceptionally pale skin he possessed were the physical marks of his lineage, traits that filled ordinary people with a mixture of intense dread and superficial reverence. He had managed his vast wealth and the large estate outside Boston with the same cold precision he brought to all matters, refusing to allow anyone to see the old wounds he kept hidden beneath his formal manner. Years ago, before he left for his long travels, he had been engaged to a high-society woman named Lillian, whom he believed possessed a genuine character during their 18 months of careful courtship. He discovered shortly before their planned wedding that her warmth was merely a calculated act designed to secure his fortune while she secretly despised his true nature. The discovery came through a misplaced letter, and he ended the relationship in a single, quiet conversation that left her calling him a monster to her social circle. He left Boston 2 weeks later, spending 2 full years traveling across the distant regions of the world to rebuild the internal walls that kept his feelings safe from the intrusion of others. He returned to Stonehaven Estate because his practical obligations demanded his presence, not because he expected to find anything that would alter the cold routine of his long existence. He had calculated his return down to the smallest detail, preparing himself for the familiar looks of fear from his staff and the false pleasantries of the local families. He had not accounted for the quiet girl in the corridor who handed him his clerk's missing papers with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who simply saw a task and completed it. She had not trembled when his cold fingers brushed against hers, nor had she lowered her eyes in the exaggerated submission that most humans displayed in his presence. She had simply stated her name and returned to her work, leaving him with a lingering impression of steady clarity that he found difficult to dismiss. He spent his first few nights in the dark study, drinking the specialized dark herbal infusion that sustained his unique constitution while he reviewed the massive stack of business correspondence that had accumulated. The room was kept dim to protect his sensitive sight from the harsh glare of the lamps, and the quiet crackle of the fireplace was the only sound in the eastern wing. As he turned the pages of the estate ledgers, he noticed a significant change in the way the figures had been recorded over the past 18 months. The old, cluttered system of tracking expenses had been completely replaced by a neat, orderly method that allowed him to see the exact state of his finances in a matter of minutes. The handwriting was small, precise, and beautifully consistent across every single page, reflecting a level of care that went far beyond the requirements of an ordinary domestic job. He called Mrs. Higgins into his study on a quiet Tuesday afternoon to ask about the changes, wanting to know exactly who was responsible for the immaculate condition of the books. The head housekeeper sat down across from his desk, her expression professional and completely composed as she adjusted her spectacles. "The new ledgers were designed by Hannah Palmer, sir," Mrs. Higgins explained without hesitation, her voice carrying the quiet pride of a teacher speaking about a favored student. "She noticed the old books were becoming confused during your absence, and she took it upon herself to reorganize the entire system without being asked." "Has she been managing the other domestic accounts as well?" Caleb asked, his dark gray eyes fixed on the neat columns of figures before him. "She manages the linen inventory, the dry goods tracking, and the kitchen expenditures," the housekeeper replied. "I have never had to correct her work a single time, and she never draws attention to what she has accomplished, which I consider the mark of a truly rare character." Caleb remained quiet for a long moment, his cold fingers tapping lightly against the leather edge of the ledger book while he considered the housekeeper's words. He thought about a 22-year-old girl who spent her days caring for a massive stone house that did not belong to her, living in the smallest room beneath the roof, while receiving no special recognition for her efforts. It was a combination of quiet dedication and personal dignity that he had rarely encountered in his long life, especially among the ambitious families of the Boston high society. "She came to us from the St. Jude's orphanage when she was 16, Mrs. Higgins added softly, sensing the master's deep interest in the matter. "She had no family to give her a start in the world, yet she has never spoken a word of complaint about her past or her current station." "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins," Caleb said quietly, dismissing the housekeeper with a brief wave of his hand. "That will be all for today." He sat alone in the dimming room for hours after she left, looking out the large window at the dark outline of the pine trees, his mind returning to the steady gray eyes of the girl who had built her own strength out of complete isolation. The house ran with an exceptional smoothness over the following 2 weeks, a fact that Caleb noticed during his quiet walks through the central halls during the late afternoon hours. He made it a point to observe the small details of his surroundings, finding the dozens of tiny improvements that had been implemented during his 2 years away from the estate. The window curtains were hung with perfect alignment, the supply closets were arranged by date and category, and the kitchen operated without the loud confusion that usually accompanied a large household. It was evident that someone was thinking about the estate with a level of genuine care that extended far beyond simple management, ensuring that every corner of the stone building felt balanced and ordered. He found himself watching for the flash of a plain gray dress, or the quiet sound of soft-soled shoes on the stone floors, though Hannah remained as elusive as a shadow during the main hours of the day. He encountered her again by complete accident, on a cloudy Thursday afternoon, when the sun was blocked by heavy gray mists, allowing him to walk through the main wing without his usual discomfort. He was heading toward the long gallery when he heard the faint sound of voices coming from the partially open door of the main library. The voices were soft, one belonging to a young woman, speaking with the patient cadence of an instructor, and the other belonging to a small child who was struggling to pronounce a word. Caleb pushed the heavy oak door open slightly, his silent movements allowing him to enter the high-ceilinged room without drawing the attention of the 2 people seated at the long wooden table. Hannah was sitting close to a young boy of about 8 years old, who was dressed in the simple wool clothes of the outdoor working families. It appeared the child had been brought to the house because his mother, one of the kitchen scullery maids, had fallen ill and had no one else to watch him for the afternoon. Hannah had brought him into the quietest corner of the library to keep him occupied, using a sheet of scrap paper and a charcoal stick to guide his hand across the page. She looked up instantly when the door clicked, her steady gray eyes registering the master's presence with a quick, calm composure that did not contain any trace of panic. "Sir," she said quietly, standing up from her chair and placing a gentle hand on the young boy's shoulder to keep him calm. "I apologize for using the library without your formal permission. The boy's mother was taken with a fever this morning, and I believed this was the most suitable space to keep him quiet while she rests in the lower wing." The young boy, completely unaware of the master's formidable reputation or his unusual white hair, held up his piece of paper with a wide, proud smile. "Miss Hannah says I wrote the letter R completely right this time," the boy announced, pointing his small, charcoal-stained finger at the bottom of the page. Caleb looked down at the paper, noticing the crude but careful letters drawn in a neat line, and then he looked back at Hannah's face. "So you have," Caleb said, his low voice softer than usual as he addressed the child. He turned his gaze back to Hannah, observing the slight tension in her shoulders that revealed her concern over breaking the house rules. "There is no need to apologize, Hannah. The library is well used for this purpose. Carry on with your lessons." He turned and left the room before she could offer further explanations, his long strides carrying him back to the privacy of his Eastern study. He spent the remainder of the afternoon thinking about the scene he had just witnessed, unable to shake the impression of her natural, unforced patience. Her kindness toward the child was not a performance designed to win approval from her superiors. It was simply what she did because the child needed help, and she was the person present who could provide it. He realized with a strange pang in his chest that he could not remember the last time he had seen someone perform a genuine act of goodness without any hidden motive or desire for personal gain. The memory of Lillian's calculated warmth felt distant and brittle compared to the quiet reality of the girl who taught the alphabet to an orphan boy in the dim light of his library. The transition into late March brought a sudden, unexpected warmth to the Boston region, causing the thick snow to melt into the damp earth and coaxing the early spring birds out into the open fields. Caleb was walking through the large glass greenhouse at 7 o'clock on a Friday morning, enjoying the cool, mist-laden air before the sun could rise high enough to force him back indoors. He carried a small porcelain cup of his dark herbal infusion, his thoughts wandering through the various business decisions he needed to make before the end of the month. The heavy wooden door of the greenhouse creaked open, and Hannah stepped inside carrying a wide wicker basket and a small pair of iron shears, intending to gather fresh herbs for the cook's morning broth. She stopped short when she saw the tall, white-haired master standing near the rows of green rosemary bushes, her cheeks flushing slightly with surprise. "Sir," she said, lowering her head in a polite greeting, "I apologize for the intrusion. I did not expect anyone to be in the greenhouse at this early hour. I can easily return to the kitchens and gather the herbs later in the afternoon." "You do not need to leave, Hannah," Caleb said, his dark gray eyes tracking her movements as she stood near the entrance. "I am not using the rosemary, and the plants belong to the house, not to my private walks." She looked up at him, her gray eyes meeting his with a sudden spark of quiet amusement that broke through her usual formal composure. "No," she said softly, a tiny smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I suppose you have very little use for fresh kitchen herbs, sir." She walked forward along the narrow stone path and knelt beside the large rosemary bush, using her iron shears to cut the green sprigs with the same efficient care she brought to every task. Caleb remained where he was, leaning lightly against the wooden frame of the greenhouse, while the sharp, warm scent of the crushed herbs filled the damp air between them. The only sound in the space was the rhythmic snip of her shears, and the distant call of a blackbird perched on the stone wall outside the glass panes. "Mrs. Higgins tells me you have been at Stonehaven for 3 years, Caleb said, breaking the silence with a quiet question that had been occupying his mind for days. "Yes, sir," she replied without stopping her work, her hands moving steadily among the green leaves. "And you came here directly from the St. Jude's orphanage?" he asked, his voice low and regular. I did, she said, placing a handful of rosemary into her wicker basket. I left the parish home when I reached 16 years of age. Caleb watched the calm profile of her face as she worked, noting the complete lack of distress or bitterness in her expression when she spoke about her difficult past. 16 is a very young age to begin managing your own survival without anyone to assist you, he remarked, his dark eyes clouded with a quiet gravity. Many children leave the orphanage much younger than that, sir, Hannah said, looking up to meet his gaze directly. I considered myself exceptionally fortunate to find a secure position in a house as orderly as this one. What is your full name, Hannah? He asked, wanting to hear the words from her own lips. Hannah Palmer, sir, she said, her voice completely free of any false tragedy. Though I must admit that Palmer is simply the name the head matron gave me when I was found, as there were no documents left with me to indicate my true family. The simple, unvarnished honesty of her statement struck Caleb more deeply than any rehearsed plea for sympathy ever could have done. She was not asking for his pity, nor was she trying to make her loneliness seem beautiful. She was merely stating the facts of her life with the immense dignity of a person who had made complete peace with her history. I am sorry for the difficulties you faced, Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying a genuine weight that surprised them both. Thank you, sir, Hannah said, standing up and lifting her wicker basket onto her arm. But I have managed well enough on my own. Your tea is growing cold, sir. The morning air is still quite sharp despite the sun. She made a final, neat courtesy and walked back toward the kitchen door, leaving him alone in the green warmth of the greenhouse with a lingering thought he could not entirely put down. Mrs. Higgins had served the Hawthorne family for over 20 years, managing the massive Stone estate through its quietest periods and its most turbulent changes with the steady professionalism of an expert organizer. She had seen the master grow into the guarded, white-haired leader he was today, and she understood the exact nature of the cold walls he had built around his inner life after the betrayal by the society lady years ago. She was a thoroughly practical woman, which meant she spent her days reading the actual state of her household, rather than worrying about the strict social divisions that governed the outer world. She noticed the subtle shift in the estate's atmosphere approximately 3 weeks after the master's return, observing how his early morning walks in the greenhouse occurred with a regularity that his previous habits did not account for. She also noted that Hannah Palmer possessed a slight additional color in her pale cheeks during the hours when her ledger duties brought her into the eastern wing of the grand house. The head housekeeper chose a quiet Tuesday afternoon to address the matter while she and Hannah were reviewing the new inventory of linen sheets in the upper storage room. The space was filled with the clean, fresh scent of dried lavender, and the pale spring sunlight filtered through the narrow window, casting long squares of gold across the white fabric stacks. The master spoke with you in the garden path this morning, Hannah, Mrs. Higgins remarked in a level tone, her charcoal stick poised over the inventory board as she spoke. He was already present when I arrived to gather the fresh mint, ma'am, Hannah replied, her fingers remaining completely steady as she folded a large linen tablecloth. We exchanged a brief conversation regarding the kitchen supplies. I apologize if my presence caused any inconvenience to his walk. It caused no inconvenience, the older woman said, looking up from her board to study the girl's face with a sharp, discerning gaze. I am not raising a complaint. I am simply making an observation about the house. She returned to her writing, her hand moving smoothly across the paper, before she spoke again, in a lower, more deliberate voice. How are you finding the master's presence now that he has returned to take charge of the daily operations? The adjustment has been entirely straightforward, ma'am, Hannah said honestly, her gray eyes clear and open. The master is very precise in his instructions, which makes the accounting work much easier to complete than it would be under an employer who does not understand the business of the estate. He noticed you in the grand hall on his first afternoon, Mrs. Higgins said softly. He asked me about the ledgers shortly afterward. He noticed a box of dropped documents, ma'am, Hannah explained, her voice remaining perfectly calm. I was simply the person who happened to be nearby to return them before they were lost. Mrs. Higgins lowered her inventory board and looked at the young woman for several long seconds, her experienced eyes reading the absolute lack of pretense in Hannah's steady features. She recognized that the girl was not trying to use the master's interest to elevate her own position, nor was she playing a calculated game to win favor within the large household. "You are a sensible girl, Hannah," the housekeeper said finally, a brief nod of approval softening her stern face. "And I believe you genuinely mean what you say, rather than performing a role for my benefit. Keep that honesty about you. It is the most valuable thing you possess in a house like this." "I intend to, ma'am," Hannah said, placing the folded tablecloth onto the high shelf. "Good," said Mrs. Higgins, turning back toward the door with her notes under her arm. "That will be all for the linen counts today. Return to the lower ledger room when you are finished." The massive storm that struck the coastal Massachusetts region in late March provided the sudden, inescapable proximity that altered the relationship between the white-haired master and the quiet servant girl forever. The weather turned violently in the early evening, bringing a deep, sudden darkness that swallowed the pine woods within minutes and hurling sheets of heavy rain against the stone walls of the estate like handfuls of gravel. Hannah was working in the small parlor adjacent to the main library when the wind picked up, checking the iron window fastenings to ensure the storm did not damage the old wood frames. The window in the far corner of the room was notoriously stubborn, its heavy iron latch having grown rusty and stiff over the course of the long winter months. As she strained against the metal, her fingers slipping on the cold iron, the heavy oak door creaked open, and Caleb entered the room. He had removed his formal coat and rolled his white linen sleeves to his elbows, revealing the smooth, pale strength of his arms in a way that made him appear far more accessible than he did in his formal garments. His white hair was slightly loose around his face, catching the silver flash of the lightning that illuminated the window glass every few seconds. "The iron latch is completely rusted," Hannah said without turning around, assuming it was one of the younger footmen who had come to assist with the upper window frames. "Allow me." Caleb's low voice sounded right behind her, causing her to step back as he moved into the narrow space between the table and the glass. He reached up and took hold of the stiff metal handle, his quiet, natural strength evident as he forced the rusty mechanism to turn until the window sealed tightly against the driving rain outside. "Thank you, sir," Hannah said, smoothing her apron down as she looked up at him in the dim light of the parlor. "Mrs. Higgins tells me that you have become entirely indispensable to the management of this household," Caleb said, remaining by the window while the thunder rumbled deeply through the stone floor beneath their feet. "Mrs. Higgins is very kind, sir," Hannah replied carefully, keeping her hands clasped in front of her. "I merely assist her with the daily calculations and the tracking of the supplies." "The housekeeper is not given to empty praise, Hannah," Caleb said, his dark gray eyes turning to her face with an intensity that felt entirely real. He stepped a single pace closer, his cold presence bringing a strange, quiet stillness to the small room. "May I ask you a direct question about what you told me in the greenhouse?" "Of course, sir," she said, her gray eyes remaining steady despite the close proximity of the powerful master. "When you told me you had managed well enough without a true name or a family," he murmured, "did you mean the words completely, or was it simply the thing you say to prevent people from offering a pity you do not want?" Hannah looked at him for a long, quiet moment, while the rain hammered against the glass beside them, the flashes of lightning casting his pale features into sharp relief. "It was both, sir," she answered honestly, her voice dropping to a softer cadence. "I meant it because the managing has built a strength that I value deeply, but I also said it because performing complete independence is far easier than explaining the more complicated truth." "And what is the more complicated truth, Hannah?" Caleb asked, his voice holding the patient stillness of someone who had all the time in the world to listen. "The truth, sir," she said softly, "is that I have spent 22 years being completely sufficient to myself because there was simply no other choice available to me. I have become very good at it, but I find occasionally that the sufficiency is lonely in a way that simple hard work cannot entirely fix. The words settled into the quiet room with an immense weight, and Caleb looked at her with an expression that shifted from his usual cold distance into a look of deep, shared recognition. "Yes," he said, his low voice carrying a quiet certainty that echoed her own thoughts. "I understand that specific loneliness perfectly, more than you could possibly know." The private investigation that Caleb initiated through his legal clerks in the city of Boston required 6 weeks of constant research, yielding results that neither the master nor the servant girl had ever anticipated finding. He had begun the search under the practical justification of clarifying the legal status of a dependent member of his domestic staff, but he privately recognized that he could not allow Hannah Palmer to remain a mystery he had not tried to solve. The final written report from his trusted solicitor arrived on a clear Monday morning, and Caleb read the documents twice before sending a message to the lower kitchen wing to summon Hannah to his eastern study. She arrived shortly after the noon hour, her expression composed and professional as she stood across the wide mahogany desk from him, her gray eyes waiting for his instruction. "I have spent the past several weeks conducting a thorough inquiry into the circumstances surrounding your birth at the parish house, Hannah," Caleb began, his voice careful and deliberate. "I should have informed you before I began the search, and I apologize for taking that liberty without your formal consent." Hannah remained perfectly still, her hands clasped against her plain gray dress as she looked at the white sheets of paper lying on the dark wood desk. "What did the search find, sir?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Your mother was a young woman named Catherine Hale," Caleb explained, looking directly into her eyes. "She passed away 11 days after your birth due to a severe fever. She was 20 years old, the daughter of Sir Robert Hale, a gentleman of modest but respectable standing, whose family lived in a quiet town in Massachusetts. And my father?" Hannah whispered, the space between them growing intensely quiet as she waited for the final piece of her history. "Your father," Caleb said with exceptional care, "was a younger brother of the previous master of this very estate, a man who died long before I inherited the title and the land. Their relationship was kept entirely hidden from the family because of the social differences between them, and your mother was sent away when her condition became known to her relatives." Hannah sat down in the nearest wooden chair, her legs suddenly losing the strength to keep her standing as the immense weight of the revelation settled into her mind. "I have been working as a laundry maid and an accountant in the house that belonged to my own blood relations," she said slowly, her gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound realization. "Yes," Caleb said, his white hair catching the bright sun that streamed through the high study windows. "You are not legally connected to my branch of the family, but you possess a true right to be in this house that goes far beyond a simple domestic employment. I received these documents only yesterday morning, and I wanted you to know the absolute truth of your origins immediately." Hannah looked at the powerful, pale man across the desk, seeing the complete absence of doubt in his dark gray eyes, and realizing the immense effort he had expended on her behalf. "You did all of this for a servant girl who had no claim on your time," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly for the first time since he had met her. "I did it because you deserve to know exactly who you are, Hannah," Caleb replied, his cold hand resting flat against the papers on his desk. "Whatever that truth turned out to be, you had a right to carry your mother's true name." They remained in the quiet study for a long time, the steady ticking of the grandfather clock, the only sound as the former orphan began the long process of rebuilding her identity from the ruins of her forgotten past. The weeks that followed the meeting in the Eastern study required both Caleb and Hannah to navigate a completely new set of circumstances, as the household adjusted to the visible shift in their daily interactions. They had returned to the formal routine of master and clerk for the sake of the other servants, but the formality had become a chosen frame rather than a true description of the deep affection that had grown between them. They spoke openly during the quiet late afternoons in the library, their conversations moving naturally from the management of the estate to the personal thoughts they had kept hidden for so many years. The white-haired king found his cold walls collapsing completely in her presence, replaced by a quiet warmth that he had never permitted himself to feel since the betrayal of his youth. "You are still uncomfortable with the fact that I searched for your family without your permission, Hannah," Caleb remarked one afternoon, when she brought the weekly kitchen accounts to his desk, remaining near the door with a lingering hesitation. "I am far more comfortable with the truth than I expected to be, sir," she said honestly, looking at his pale features with her steady gaze. "But I find the process of allowing someone else's actions to matter to my happiness is deeply disorienting after so many years of relying entirely on myself." "I find myself in an identical position, as it happens," Caleb murmured, standing up from his chair and moving toward her with his silent, graceful stride. He stopped 3 paces away from her, his white hair framing a face that was completely open and free of his usual defensive arrogance. "I have spent decades constructing an independent life that did not require the affection of any human being," he said softly, his dark eyes fixed on her face. "I find that my systems are failing completely, and I love you with a certainty that I cannot manage or control any longer." "I love you as well, Caleb," Hannah said simply, using his given name for the first time, without any performance of drama or hesitation. "I know this goes against every social rule of the city, but refusing to state a true thing does not make it less real." The local high society of Boston discovered the situation within a month, their reaction predictably unkind, as rumors began to circulate about the wealthy, mysterious master and the plain servant girl who had captured his attention. Caleb protected her honor with the immediate, decisive action of a leader, writing clear and dignified personal letters to every prominent family in the region to explain her true heritage as a daughter of the Hale family. He also contacted her mother's surviving brother, Arthur Hale, a quiet gentleman of 50 years who lived in a small rural town in Massachusetts, inviting him to Stonehaven Estate to meet the niece he had been told did not survive the orphanage. The uncle arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, his gray eyes so identical to Hannah's that the resemblance was instantly striking to everyone who saw them stand together in the sitting room. The meeting between Hannah and her uncle lasted for 2 hours, filled with the quiet clearing away of old family secrets and the shared joy of a reconnection that neither had expected to experience in their lifetimes. Arthur Hale wept quietly when he saw his sister's features reflected in the young woman's face, promising to support her future with the full respect and standing of her mother's family. A respected high society matriarch, Lady Harrington, publicly welcomed Hannah at a prominent gathering shortly afterward, ending the unkind gossip of the town and sealing her acceptance among the wealthy families of the region. Caleb asked Hannah to marry him on a beautiful morning in May, standing under the blossoming white petals of the old apple tree in the kitchen garden, where their first real conversation had occurred months before. The air was filled with the fresh, clean scent of damp earth and crushed rosemary, and the blackbird sang loudly from the high green hedges that border the stone paths. He did not offer an exaggerated performance of romance. He simply held out his cold hand to her, with the absolute clarity and honesty that she had come to value above all things. "I would like you to remain at Stonehaven Estate for the rest of our days, Hannah," he said softly, his white hair bright in the soft morning sun. "Not as a clerk or a helper, but as my wife and the mistress of this house. People will continue to say many complicated things about our marriage, Caleb," she replied, her fingers tracing the smooth edge of her wicker basket before she reached out to take his hand. "Let them say what they wish," he murmured, his long, cold fingers closing around hers with a gentle, protective warmth that felt entirely secure. "I have observed you being completely yourself in every circumstance, and I know that what you are is more than sufficient for everything this life could ever require of us." Hannah looked at his pale, handsome face and understood that she had finally found the true belonging she had stopped hoping for during her long years of isolated self-sufficiency. They were married in the middle of the summer, in a small, elegant stone church outside Boston, the ceremony attended by Uncle Arthur Hale, Mrs. Higgins, and a quiet gathering of local people who genuinely wished them well. The transition from a servant to the mistress of the grand house occurred without any loss of her personal dignity, as she brought the same practical care to her new position that she had always given to the linen stores. 3 years passed quickly, transforming the cold, silent stone building into a warm and joyful home filled with open windows, shared reading corners, and the laughter of a young child. They had a beautiful 2-year-old daughter named Catherine, who inherited her mother's steady gray eyes and her father's quiet, focused personality, bringing a final sense of complete healing to the old estate. Standing by the large parlor window, with little Catherine resting securely on her hip, Hannah watched the bright spring sunlight cast long, warm stripes across the clean wood floor, her mind returning to the journey that had brought her to this quiet moment. She thought about the cold March morning 3 years ago, when a white-haired master with a cup of bitter tea had asked her if she could manage without a name, and she realized how much her world had changed since she stopped relying entirely on her own isolated strength. She understood now that true love did not require a person to surrender their independence or perform a role for the sake of others. It simply required the immense courage to be genuinely seen by another person and to allow that care to matter. The future stretched out before them like a wide, sunlit path through the pine woods, and she looked forward to every step of the shared life they had built together out of complete honesty and a quiet, lasting devotion.